Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you. You might want to sit down, though, because I have to do 15 more minutes of compliance with you guys before we get into the story here. I'm still really uncomfortable with people showing me admiration, right? My default setting is less than. It has been for so long. I was told that by so many people, by the multitudes of media and everything, that when I'm standing next to somebody and they're giving me a compliment, my behavior of my body language still looks down at my feet. And then if somebody says something like, "That Leaf is an asshole or a jerk," I'm just like, yeah, that sounds about right. This is just my story, okay? It's like everybody else's. There's some unique paths that I had to go down that are a little different, but all the people you deal with, your clients, they're just like me. You're all just like me, that we're all flawed human beings trying to be better every single day. And it took me a long time to figure that out. So I'm from a real small town in Montana called Great Falls. To give you some size here, I'm the only Montanan ever drafted in the first round of the NFL draft. There are more first-round draft picks in the Manning family than the whole state of Montana ever, okay? So I thought I was pretty special, and there also wasn't no other trailblazers. Everything I did was to get out of that small town and be a professional athlete. That's all I ever wanted. I don't believe you're a product of your environment. Otherwise, I would have never ended up in a prison cell. I was raised by two unbelievably loving, character-driven parents, grandparents, aunts, uncles, brothers, cousins, a supportive community. So I don't necessarily buy into that, right? Otherwise, that wouldn't have been the case. I got placed on a pedestal pretty early in my life, probably around 13 years old, because I could do something really well, and that was play sports. And in a small town, that makes you as famous as anybody. My mother could never really figure out why everybody watched her son or talked about her son. It just didn't dawn on her, and she saw things in me early on how I behaved. I was extroverted. I was really gregarious out there on the basketball court. Football field, not so much. You wear the helmet, the shoulder pads. No one really, but when you're on the basketball court, you're right in the face of your audience, and I had a blast, right? I enjoyed dunking on people and showing them up and all that stuff. I wasn't very popular. I thought I was different. I actually thought I was better than most of the people in that community simply because I could play a sport better. I think it's a big reason why I got out of that town and made it to where I made it to. But it also didn't develop any social skills to deal with things in the proper manner. I was recruited by pretty much everybody in the country. Mike Price at Washington State called me January 1st, 1994, so I'm going to date myself a little bit here, but he called and said, "What are you doing?" I said, "I'm watching the Rose Bowl." And he said, "Well, I'll make you a deal. You come here and play for me, we'll play in that game together." And I bought it, hook, line, and sinker. I ran into mom and dad's bedroom and said, "I'm going to Washington State." They both looked at each other. They were pleased with that decision. It was far enough away from home, but close enough where mom and dad probably felt like they could still pull the puppet strings a little bit. I did no research, right? I didn't realize I hadn't been to a Rose Bowl since 1931. So it was a literal leap of faith. And when I got there, I was like everybody else. I was the best athlete from their high school who was now there to try to do something, to work together as a team, to build a common goal and achieve it, and we did, right? We did something that hadn't been done there in 67 years. And we went to the Rose Bowl. We won a Pac-10 championship. I was a finalist for the Heisman Trophy, like you were told. And it was the greatest year of my life, essentially. And then the opportunity came to leave college early, to play professional sports, or to stay in college. And it was my dream. Since I was As far back as I can remember, I wanted to be Terry Bradshaw. I wanted to be Dan Fouts. I wanted to do that. And so I chose to do it, and I declared for the NFL draft. I was 21 years old. And on April 18th, 1998, the San Diego Chargers would draft me second overall and pay me, the 21-year-old, $31 million. Now, I didn't ever believe that money would change me. I grew up in a very strict family that coveted the money and how he took care of it. My father's a 2-tour Vietnam veteran who came home and raised 3 boys, built a business. He's my hero. I developed this sense of what success was. And success for me was money, power, and prestige. It was either I saw it on TV or it was displayed or whatever. I don't know why. But now in my mind, I had it all, right? I had the money, which gave me this power, and the prestige of being a starting NFL quarterback was everything that my family, my peers, everyone wanted. And there I was. When you get drafted, it's all about you. You go from this team concept to an individual one where your agent and your publicist is trying to sell you to everybody. And some people can switch back and forth between that. Then you get drafted and you become this team member again. I just wasn't capable. I didn't have the life skills to deal with it in a healthy way. I had all the things coming at me, right? The Nike endorsement, the Pepsi endorsement, Rolex, cars. The funniest thing about getting to the NFL is you couldn't buy a drink in college because you were so broke, and now you go to any bar and everybody wants to buy you a drink. So it doesn't make any sense. And I just wasn't prepared for it. I went out and won my first 2 starts. That hadn't happened since John Elway did it in 1983. And then the wheels fell off. I played in a game where I had the worst possible performance of my life. I was humiliated. And it wasn't how I played. It was how I dealt with it. The next day, with a reporter in front of a camera that would be replayed and replayed and replayed. Viral videos didn't exist then. The internet had just started. This was one of the first. Every time my name got brought up, this was the picture people got of me. And it was a caricature. It was this petulant child, angry, because he wasn't getting his own way. And he was going to show you how big and strong and tough he was. And then after that, I didn't take any accountability, right? I was so angry with myself, but I kept backing myself into a corner, which I had always done my whole life. And I fought out. Right? If I performed well on the baseball diamond or the football field or the basketball court, everything was kind of pushed under the rug. Right now, in the bright lights in front of the whole country, there was no hiding from it, and I didn't have the accountability in me to face it head on. I bounced around from team to team for the next 5 years. Nothing changed, right? Just because I go somewhere doesn't mean things get better, because no matter where I go, there I am. I was the problem. And instead of going into my coach's office in my last stop in Seattle and telling him, Coach, I can't get out of bed. I feel like I'm lazy. I was overweight. I was more ashamed of all that, and the understanding of what mental health didn't exist. And instead, I walked into his office and I quit. I quit the thing I wanted to do since I was 4 years old simply because I didn't have the wherewithal or understanding to simply say, hey, I'm really struggling here. Can you help me? That's foreign to us athletes. We're supposed to be big and strong and handle everything on our own. And the locker room is supposed to be this tight-knit unit, and it isn't. You're different, or that's the way you believe. And I walked away. I just quit. But I still thought I had those 3 pillars of success, right? The money, the power. The prestige had a bit of tarnish on it. But hey, former NFL quarterback, come on, that'll give me a lot of free swag still. That's just how I thought of things. And I disappeared, and I figured everything else would go away. But it's 21 years later, and I'm the one standing in front of you telling you my life story, because no matter what, every April, my name gets brought up. 2 reasons. I was drafted alongside arguably the greatest probably to ever play the position. And 2, you had to be pretty damn good to be considered a bust. Now, when I left the league, I assumed that everything would change. I would just kind of disappear, but I'm considered the biggest bust in draft history in the NFL. Everybody's telling me how awful I was. That thing I told you about early on about what I'm used to hearing, I started to believe it. I started to consume it. It was who I was. There's no mention of drugs and alcohol to this point because there just wasn't any. My first drink was at 18 years old. The only drug I've ever taken in my life is an opiate. I was introduced to opiates in college after orthopedic surgeries. They worked. They took away that physical acute pain. When I was done taking them, I got back out there, I rehabbed, I got back out on the field. Now, competition was no longer there, and competition was my first drug of choice, by far. I had to win at everything. Damn the results, too. I was Ricky Bobby-ish. It was first or last, okay? And that was my first drug of choice. Now I didn't have that to go to, right? And when I walked away, having been introduced to this drug, of course, I knew it existed. While in Vegas, about 3 months after I'd retired, we were at a fight. They were announcing the celebrities in the audience. The MC announces Tiger Woods and Charles Barkley, and the audience just jumps up in applause and claps, and then they announce my name. The whole MGM Grand just booed and hissed. And it's not like that hadn't happened before, right? You play football, you walk into an opposing team stadium, and you're the quarterback, they boo you. But you have this armor on, this helmet, the shoulder pads, and you almost are emboldened by it. What my addict mind told me, because I was an addict long before I ever took a drug, now that I know how addicts behave. What my addict mind told me in that moment, and what they were saying to me was, not only you were a terrible football player, Ryan, you were an awful human being. That's how I interpreted it. And sure enough, that evening, an acquaintance of mine at a party that I was going to go to, because I was going to have to go to a bunch of parties after the fight and mingle with people, and where there were Super Bowl champs and Hall of Famers, where I always felt less than and judged when I walked into those rooms, offered me a couple Vicodin. And this would be the first time I really took them for an emotional issue rather than a physical one, and it worked. It worked for me. Some people it works for, some people it doesn't. That's what worked for me. And I would walk in and out of those parties the rest of the night and not feel any of that. I didn't feel judgment, I didn't feel fear, I didn't feel angry, I didn't feel any of it. I just was numb. They're called painkillers for a reason. That's what they do. I was in this emotional state of pain, and it worked, and it fixed me, or at least I thought it fixed me. This was the most unhealthy, toxic way to deal with the situation. And it worked for me. And that would begin the stretch of 8 years of just utter nonsense, of finding pills, disappearing, showing up every few months maybe, just to make sure everybody knew and remembered me, and I got that important feeling back. Show up at a movie premiere, made everybody believe everything was okay by whisking off to Cabo on a private jet and renting a yacht. I mean, just absurd things to make the perception of who I was so much more important than what was really going on with me. And that was my life. That's what I was doing every single day. Doctors at first, right? You walk in, Doc, here's my x-rays. I got beat up for a living. I'm in pain. I mean, there was some truth in that. I was in pain. Just wasn't the one I was willing to tell him, because his answer, of course, would have been, here, I'm going to refer you to this doctor. He's a counselor. Let's have a discussion. That, for me, was weakness. And also, I liked getting high because I didn't feel anything. I was numb. I don't want to feel those things that people told me anymore. I just didn't want to feel anything. And it worked. So there's no way I wanted you to take that away from me. But of course, when you're making $5 million a year and you quit that job and pretend like you're still making $5 million a year to the public, that goes away in a hurry. And now I'm back in my hometown where I'm supposed to be the hero. The only player ever from the state of Montana to be drafted in the first round. Now is living in a little mother-in-law apartment behind a house. And every single morning, the first thought in my mind is, do I have pills? And if I don't, how do I get them? And that was my day. If it took me 2 hours to find them, my day was over. If it took the entire day, that was my day. First it started with doctors, but in my hometown, of course, that's over in a hurry. You cannot doctor shop like that without being noticed. Next was going to friends' homes, pretending I was interested in spending time with them, old acquaintances, going through their medicine cabinets. Till ultimately, at the end, simply going around the outskirts of my hometown, knocking on doors. If no one answered, I'd feel the handle. If it was unlocked, I'd peek in and yell, and then go essentially rob them. 9 times out of 10, there would be some sort of opiate in their medicine cabinet, from a past dental surgery, anything. What always dumbfounded me was the idea that there would be a bottle of pills in there that were prescribed like 6 months ago and they'd taken 2. And I'd think, what's wrong with these people? You know, they'd be gone in 3 days for me, but not everybody's the same. Not everybody's an addict, Ryan. But I was grateful that they had them. And I had all this shame and all this guilt about what I was doing. And I'd walk by my mirror at night sometimes and just clamor out, please somebody help me. You're just this junkie. And I knew I needed help. I knew I did. I had been to treatment even, where I had been introduced to Vivitrol. And it worked for me, right? In a controlled environment. I continued to use it afterwards. I stopped taking it. I even had 2 vials of it still at my doctor's office, where all I had to do was wait the 7 to 10 days or whatever it was to stay opiate-free. But I couldn't do it. I could not do it on my own, no matter how hard I tried. I wanted to get to that doctor and have him give me that shot. That for me is why it's not an end-all be-all, right? There's a huge accumulation of everything that goes into getting sober and finding this acceptance and peace. I couldn't do it on my own. And many of those nights I clamored out for that help. And in my eyes, none of it came. Until finally my higher power, whatever you want to call it, said, all right, dude, you don't get it. I'm just going to send the sheriff's department to help you. And that's what happened. And they showed up, and they arrested me in front of my father and my brother. And I would go into jail, and I wouldn't come out. I'd spend the next 32 months of my life in prison. That statement alone never has ever or did ever cross my mind of being something that actually could happen. I grew up in a very middle-class, white, privileged community. I was never marginalized. I felt none of that. So that, in my mind, was not a reality, and here it was. And the fear of that was overwhelming. A, because, of course, I was in a jail cell. B, because now I was going to have to deal with all these feelings that I had never wanted to deal with. And for my safety, apparently, they held me in solitary confinement for the first, 90 days in prison. 90 days with me in my brain is awful. It's just awful, especially detoxing from opiates. And there I was. But that point I made to you earlier about how I was a drug addict long before I ever took a drug, this was going to be the perfect example for you, right? I was removed from the substance. The substance was out of my system, yet I did not change or want to change. In fact, I was more miserable, I was more self-loathing, I was more angry. I did nothing. I sat on my butt in my cell. I went outside twice in those 32 months. I had a 13-inch flat screen TV at the end of my bed with about 45 channels, the NFL Red Zone when it was the fall. It is not a deterrent. I sat and did nothing until, of course, again, my higher power showed up, this time in the form of my roommate. He was an Afghan-Iraqi war veteran. He had done something that a lot of people in their life have done, and that's drive drunk. It just so happened that night he would kill somebody. He was on leave from a tour in Afghanistan, and he would have spent the last 8 years in prison, and he was now my roommate. And one day, after I've watched him for months simply come to terms with what he did, make amends, try to get better. He wanted to get out. He didn't know if he was ever going to get out. He wanted to get out. He wanted to use his GI Bill. He wanted to go to engineering school. He did all these things to try to better himself in the worst possible place you could imagine. And I looked at him and I'm like, why are you doing this? Look at us. Nothing's going to change. We're losers. Look at us. And he just had enough of my attitude, clearly, and he confronted me. And he said, you don't get it. You have your head so far buried in the sand, you don't realize the impact you could have on people in here or when you get out. Because Ryan, you're going to get out at some point. You're just not going to hide in here forever. And I've had many of those kind of come to Jesus speeches in my life from coaches and mentors and family members and stuff, and I tossed them away. In this moment, maybe because the substance had been out of my system long enough, but for whatever reason, I acquiesced. And I did it begrudgingly, right? I can just still envision myself walking down the corridor in my red jumpsuit, like kicking metaphorical rocks like a little child, thinking, this is stupid. This isn't going to help anybody. Doesn't he know how important I am? His suggestion was to go down to the prison library and help prisoners who didn't know how to read learn how to read. And I went. It was another leap of faith. Before I knew it, I came back the next day and the next, and a week had passed and another week, and I was sleeping better. I was communicating with my family. I was more personable. And I had this epiphany like, Ryan, you're being of service to a human being for the first time in your life. I used to think that me showing up on your screen on Sundays and Saturdays was my service to all of you. What a silly concept, right? But I was being of service to another human being for the first time in my life, and in a place where you cannot show vulnerability at all. And you have these 50-year-old men telling me, I can't read. Can you help me? That made a huge impression on me, okay? And before I knew it, a month and 2 months had passed, and now I was the TA for the substance abuse counselor while I was in there. And I knew that when I got out, it was going to have to be the foundation of who I was, or nothing would change. There were 88 people on our block there, 86 of which have either gotten out and gone back or have never gotten out. My roommate and I are the only two who have stayed out. We are the exceptions. The rule is you have an addiction, you go to treatment, you get out, you don't continue. You either go to prison, you die, or you get help. That's it. And so I knew that was going to have to be the foundation. And when I got out, I knew I was not healthy, right? For whatever reason, I didn't use while in prison. And there were drugs everywhere. I don't know why I didn't. It was the perfect opportunity. Sit and do nothing, feel self-loathing, feel angry, numb it all away, watch TV. But I didn't. But I knew when I got out, my muscle memory just takes over, right? Not a controlled environment. My muscle memory would take right over in how I deal with problems. And that would immediately snap back into place. So I knew I needed help. And I reached out to my doctor. He immediately put me on Vivitrol again. The freedom of not having to obsess over something is so freeing, and to actually do the work on yourself. Listen to the counselor. Listen to the psychiatrist. Listen to the doctors. Listen to the readings. Listen to your fellow peers that are in treatment with you. And I went and sought treatment, and that's what I did. I spent 90 days in treatment post-prison. Most people think that's stupid. Most of the guys that get out of prison think that's stupid because, like, why would you go to another institution? This had to be a 180-degree lifestyle change for me. Otherwise, nothing was going to change because I was definitely the problem. And for the next 18 months, I would pretty much do everything opposite that I'd ever done. I was George Costanza. And it was working, just like it did for George. Where was I going to mess up, right? It's always in the back of my mind, and always in the back of minds of everybody else who probably is associated with me over the last 40 years of my life. But it didn't. Each day I got up, did the thing, right? Went and saw a counselor. Went to meetings. Had a sponsor. Worked the steps. Got sponsees. Was of service when needed be. Took my Vivitrol injection. It's just part of it. It's just part of the program. It's not the end-all be-all, right? What you guys do is you're part of the solution. You're not the solution. You're part of it. When I get a new sponsee and I tell them what the next steps are, what you have to do, I lay out a huge plan, and it's overwhelming. You're like, how the hell am I going to do that? I'm like, dude, you woke up, went, found drugs, and laid around all day. How much harder would that, you can do more. It's just a part of it. And what you're doing is you're being part of the solution. You could sit at home. You could not be part of this profession. When the opioid epidemic shows up on your TV, you can go, oh, that's sad, and click the channel away and not do anything about it. But you're not. You have a hand in this. Be a part of the solution. Don't be a part of the problem. And I commend all of you for being part of that solution and giving me the opportunity to be part of it too, because I can't control what any of you do with my message in here, ever, or anywhere. That took me a long time to figure that out. My story is no more important or less important than anybody else's. One of you could come up here and sit here and tell me your story. And I'd be sitting in this audience, and I would be as impacted and inspired and motivated just the same. Because like I said, we're all flawed human beings. We all are. The fact that it took me 38 years to figure that out, that I was no different than anybody else, is ridiculous, but it's true. Some of us take longer. I had to be humbled in a way where I woke up on a prison cell floor. That's how it had to work for me. And so grateful that it did, that I'm here, that I can do this. The fact that I could be opioid free because of all those parts of those solutions has allowed me unbelievable life. I thought playing for 20 years in the NFL, winning a couple Super Bowls, riding off into the sunset, doing Old Spice commercials the rest of my life was the answer, was the finish line. I would never have the impact on people if I had done that. I'd be simply a 42-year-old asshole with 2 Super Bowl rings. That's it. And no one wants to meet that guy. I don't. I've met a few. I feel more self-worth because of the things I went through. I think adversity is the best thing that ever can happen to us. It brings us together. It helps us relate to one another. And that's become my life because of all these parts that I accepted, right? My best thinking takes me to a prison cell, so I don't make proper choices. I need help. I need help from the doctor that prescribes Vivitrol. I need help from the counselor that shows me a way to discuss things and talk about it. I need all of those things, all those parts of the solution, right? Those 3 things that I thought were success, right, had to be changed. The first job I took out of treatment was with a company in Southern California where it was a sober living environment, where I was hired as a driver and a manager in the house. And when my boss at the time came up to me and said, hey, we'd love to offer you the job, it pays $15 an hour. I tell you this only because I was making $5 million a year and was miserable. I had just been offered a job for $15 an hour and felt more value than I'd ever in my life. And I can't explain it, right? I just know it's true. And that's where it started. He had a vision, of course, of many different things and where my story could take me and what it could do for other people. And of course, I've only been out of prison just over 4 years, everybody. This is not like it was 20 years ago or something. The meteoric change in my life because of my choices and what I chose to do differently is the result. I met the most wonderful woman in the world who I actually could have a vulnerable and intimate relationship with. Women were simply objects for me when I was a player, right? It was to develop that kind of relationship because I was opiate free. She's given me the most amazing 16-month-old baby boy who is already 3 feet tall, if you can believe that. And as a lot of your peers who I worked with up to this point love his name. MacGyver is his name, by the way. So, I never thought I'd be able to stand in front of a room full of people and tell them that I was grateful for having spent 32 months in prison. I don't recommend it, but I'm so grateful that it happened for me. And my hope is that when I stand in front of you and I tell you this simple story, is that no one has to go to the same bottom that I did. Now, don't get me wrong, I think anybody who deals with this type of affliction has to go to whatever bottom their bottom is to find out what that means. Humility is simply the understanding of who you are, truly. I was always Ryan Leaf. I still hate it when people say my full name for whatever reason. And I thought, I'll never have a son. I'm not going to give my son that last name. I forget that it was my grandfather's, that it was my father's. That's a selfish way to look at things. And that's the way I thought of it. Those 3 pillars I thought were success, of course, after receiving that job and understanding what true value was, we're going to have to be completely flipped on their ear, okay? And if there's anything you guys take away from my speech today and implement in your life at all, these have worked for me. And when a newcomer comes up to me and talks to me, I simply tell him what worked for me. I don't try to impose my will on him and tell him how to do something. When I walked into the meeting, I went up to the guy that had 32 years of sobriety, and I looked at him and I saw this life that he had and this success and this freedom, and I said, could you help me? I want your life. How did you get it? And then I followed his advice verbatim, and I continue to do so. Number 1 is accountability. I was never accountable to anybody or anything my whole life. The moment I was able to walk by that mirror in my prison cell and look at myself and say, Ryan, you're here because of what you did, nobody else, right? Because I blamed the media, I blamed the NFL, I blamed the doctors, I blamed my family, I blamed my hometown, I blamed everybody else. But what was my part in it, right? I never took a look at that, ever. That's accountability. Number 2 is spirituality. There was a joke that Sports Illustrated ran when I was in college that went, what's the difference between God and Ryan Leaf? And the punchline is that God doesn't think he's Ryan Leaf. And I thought it was hilarious, right? But there's something about walking in front of a stadium of 100,000 people and putting your arms out, and it's godlike. By going like this, and everybody cheers, and everybody go, and you go. Everybody's like, quiet. The idea that I was better than you simply because I could play a sport was, of course, obnoxiously silly. I don't know what God is. I'm spiritual. I can get that out of anything. The fact that I'm up in front of you all telling you my story after just over 4 years ago I was in a prison cell is spiritual. The point is, I don't know who God is. I just know there is one, and I'm not it. And that's a big change in my life. The third thing is community. I was never part of the community, right? I was always either hoisted above it or thought I was above it until I crashed and burned. And then when I needed a community to help me, I didn't want anybody to know that I was this drug addict, felon. No one to know. I live in Los Angeles, where the recovery community is the biggest and best in the world, I do believe. There's 2,500 meetings a week. I've placed myself right in the middle of it. And then I travel the country and do this type of thing. And I meet people along my way. And my community gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And the relationship I've built with your guys' company over the last year is an example of that. My community has gotten bigger. I walked into the room today earlier to practice for this, and it was like we knew what we were talking about with one another immediately. My community continues to get bigger and bigger. So if you can take away those three things and apply them in your life, I guarantee you unbelievable things can happen. I'm the perfect example of that. Football was the last thing on my mind, right? It was the most toxic thing. It's the last thing I thought. It made me think of myself in the worst possible fashion. My therapist and I work on a ton of stuff. One of them was so important 3 years ago, simply an affirmation every morning in the mirror. What other people think of me is none of my business. That one's hard. I remember the first few days I started saying it, it was like through gritted teeth, like, what other people think of me is none of my business. And this morning, popped out of bed, right? Simple. You look at yourself in the mirror, what other people think of me is none of my business. I can't control anything. I can't control what any of you do with my message, what you think. You may leave and go, that dude's full of shit. But if there's one person in this room that takes something away from it, it was well worth my time. And that's the way I validate or rationalize it. I'll finish with this. And choice. Everybody has a fork in the road, no matter what. We just listen to compliance talk about decision-making, choices, right? Doing the next right thing to the benefit of your client to find this peaceful, unchaotic life that I found, like so many others can and will if they make it part of their solution. You always have a choice, regardless of the situation, a fork in the road, to deal with something in a positive and healthy way or a negative and toxic one. Simple. Most people deal with things in a negative and toxic way. It's easier. Taking the high road, love, all of that, doing the right thing, that's harder. This is an example I use all the time, right? I use a Q-tip to clean out my ear. My ears after I take showers. And a while back, I was cleaning my ear out, and I threw the Q-tip at the trash can, and it bounced off the edge and fell on the floor. And my eyes immediately went right back to the mirror. And I had this thought. I'm like, was I just entitled that somebody was going to pick up after me my whole life? So I went over and picked up the Q-tip, and I put it in the trash can. And it was kind of a real simple, small step of doing the next right thing. It's just a small example of that, because there's a huge amount of choices you'll make in your life, from small to large ones. And even today, right? Just because I'm up here standing in front of you telling my story doesn't mean I don't have everything figured out. You all know who are fathers or parents. I'm the father of a 16-month-old. I have no idea what the hell's going on right now, okay? And the choices I make are wrong most of the time. But I was getting ready and I was taking my shower and I threw the Q-tip at the trash can and it fell off to the side of the floor. My eyes went immediately back to the mirror, because it's, I'm about to walk into a group full of people. They're going to applaud me, and it's going to be all about me and everything. And I immediately said, dude, what are you doing? You talk about this all the time. You're going to talk about it in an hour. Go pick up the damn Q-tip. And I went and picked it up and put it in. That's just a small example. And at 18, if I would have started making those small little choices, they add up and they add up and they add up to the point where I'm standing in front of a house. If I told you that when I was 18, I'd be standing in front of a house making the choice to break in and steal pills. That 18-year-old would tell you, you are insane. I would never do something like that. But because I had stopped making those little positive changes in my life and choices, they added up and added up and added up. And that moment happened. And it was over like that. And I was in the house, and they were in my hand. And the ends justified the means, because I didn't have to feel any of it. And the shame cycle just kept spinning and spinning and spinning. And that's who I was. You have that choice. And you made the right one, right? A, you took the job here. B, this has nothing to do with any of you. This is about somebody else, somebody who's struggling so much, they just need a reprieve. You are part of the solution. Take that away from today, that you are part of it. There are many parts that go into this, like we talked about, but you are a huge, integral part of the recovery and the lives of people who you interact with day in and day out. And I applaud you for that, and I think you should applaud yourself for that, and I appreciate the opportunity to be able to stand here in front of you and tell you that your product was one of my parts to the solution. So when somebody comes and talks to me and asks, Ryan, I want what you have, how do I get it? It's part of the plan. And you are part of that plan and part of that solution. So thank you all very much for being you, being here, listening to me. I appreciate you all very, very much.
So I can just tell you one thing, you're not a boss, brother. You're a fighter, you're a champion, more importantly, you're a survivor. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Ryan Leaf.